Hello, everyone. This is part 1 of week 2 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We are talking about the Protagoras, and I want to introduce a question that Plato discusses in the Protagoras as well as other dialogues, but prominently and very interestingly in the Protagoras. And that has become a major question in contemporary ethics. And that is the question of whether for a person to have one virtue, she must also have the other virtues. That idea is called the unity of the virtues, and it is an idea that is being ascribed to Socrates. It is an idea that the Stoics, when they think that Plato somehow moved away too much from Socrates, they return to it and they aim to revive it. And hence it remains throughout ancient philosophy a widely debated question. Is it possible for someone to genuinely have a virtue without having the other virtues? Socrates' answer, presumably Plato's answer, is no. The answer of the Stoics is also no. But it may seem that that is an ambitious claim. And in the recent revival of ancient ethics, the question of how plausible this is played a quite significant role. One of the most influential papers in the last decades of, invoking ancient ethics as an inspiration for discussions today, the paper Virtue and Reason from 1979 by John McDowell. McDowell introduces this idea, and he introduces it as an idea that hangs together quite deeply with another Socratic idea, which is also going to occupy us throughout the semester. And that is the thought that somehow knowledge is either identical with virtue or crucially important for virtue, where the idea is that, well, you could defend a view of all of the kinds of qualities that we tend to think of as virtues, let's say justice or kindness or courage. You could defend a view of them according to which, in every instance, you need to know something. Say you need to know what to fear and what not to fear in order to be courageous. You need to know how to distribute stuff in order to be just, and so on and so forth. And if you pursue that line of thought, then you can see that really all the particular virtues hang together or are kind of glued together by the role of knowledge or wisdom. And that is an idea that John McDowell pursues in this paper and kind of makes interesting again for contemporary ethics. And it has remained something that people who discuss whether there are resources in ancient ethics for our own thinking in ethics today have returned to repeatedly. Now, in doing so, ethicists often say, well, the unity of the virtues is a quite radical claim, one of those possibly paradoxical Socratic claims, inherently related to another quite revisionist idea, namely that virtue is so much about knowledge, which again may not be an ordinary intuition. And hence the unity of the virtues has in today's ethics a little bit the reputation of something that goes against ordinary intuitions, that goes against common sense, and that the ancients, as it were, take seriously because they take Socrates, this rebellious and revisionist thinker, seriously, but it's not necessarily something that is going to be compelling to us. Now, I want to look at a couple of moments in the dialogue in this recording and argue that that is not necessarily a compelling way to think about the unity of the virtues. I think that it is much more intuitive than recent discussions have made it seem. But for us to think about that, let's look a little bit more at the text. So Socrates is sort of setting aside the issue that is discussed at the beginning of the dialogue, namely whether virtue is teachable. Now, here's Protagoras. He claims to teach virtue, and Socrates isn't so sure whether that is even possible. But he's sort of setting that aside for the moment And he picks up on something else in Protagoras' self-representation that he says interests him. Namely, he says to Protagoras, well, you claim that you teach virtue, but you are also talking about these other things, justice, moderation, wisdom. And I would like to know from you how these other things, justice, moderation, and wisdom, relate to virtue. Socrates provides two options for Protagoras for how we might think of parts of a whole in this context. We could either think of the analogy of a face and say, the eyes, the ears, and so on are parts of a whole of the face. Or we could think of gold and say there are chunks of gold and they are parts of the gold. Protagoras says the first analogy is the one that he finds compelling. He thinks the virtues are parts of a whole, namely virtue, similar to the way in which eyes and ears and so on are parts of a face. Now, a small proviso about the way we are talking about this in the literature and in the way I'm talking now, we speak of virtues in the plural. In the text at this point, Protagoras actually does not use the notion of virtues in the plural. He speaks of virtue in the singular as a whole with parts, such that justice, moderation, wisdom, and so on aren't really called virtues. They are just called things, pragmata, and they are understood here as parts of this whole virtue in the singular. And thus, strictly speaking, and that is the kind of ambiguity often in the literature, strictly speaking, we should say here unity of virtue rather than unity of the virtues. But the latter formulation is kind of traditional, and hence it may not be worth it to depart from it. Now, Protagoras thinks that when we look at just how people behave, you sort of look around, ask yourself, is it true that for someone to have one of the virtues, they need to have all of them? It just looks like, no, that is not the case. It just looks like there are people who have one of the virtues and they don't have the others. Someone can be courageous without being just, or someone can be moderate without being just. And that's just how it looks. So, in a sense, those people in contemporary ethics who argue that the unity of the virtues is a revisionist, unintuitive claim, in a sense, they are on Protagoras' side. They go with him in saying, this is counterintuitive. Just sort of look around and you will see that there are people who have one of the virtues without having the others. Now, I want to just sort of bring something to your attention that maybe throws a different light on this, on the question of whether the unity of the virtues is intuitive. And that is to just think about the beginning of the text, to think about the beginning of the dialogue. When Hippocrates, this young student, is looking for an education, Socrates talks with him about how an education is something that you're putting into your soul and how it's going to be good for your soul or not. In that context, there is this notion of being a good person. And what Hippocrates wants ultimately is to become a good person. Now, I want to invite you to think about this notion and to ask what work it does in ethics. And I think it does a lot of work. And if it does a lot of work, that might speak in favor of thinking that there is at least something intuitive about the idea of the unity of the virtues.